if we could have everybody move to the center so that the empty seats end up on the aisles, because there's people that are coming in and want seats, and they are enforcing the fire code. So that means if there's no seats and people start sitting in the aisles, they'll be asked to leave. Okay?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace, blessings, and His mercy be upon you all this evening. On behalf of the Muslim Students Association, Campus Crusade for Christ, and College Life Christian Fellowship, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's debate. Tonight's debate will focus on the prophethood of Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the light of Islamic and Christian views. I understand that the word debate implies winning and losing, but let's not make tonight about that. Let's use this debate as an avenue where we can better understand each other. Understand that a debate of such nature shall perhaps tell us more about our differences than similarities. But remember, Muslims and Christians alike have a lot in common. Understand that we already come here with our biases, and this debate tonight isn't for the faint of heart. It's for people who can listen. People who can listen with open minds and open hearts. It's for people who are willing to change the way they think. Think with an open box. Think outside the box. We're here at UC Davis. We're critical thinkers. Listen to other people's opinions and views. Refrain from making any comments, any applause, and any agreements or disagreements with the speakers till this debate is over. In light of what happened during our last debate, most of you were there. We had some ruckus. We had some disturbances. So this time around, we do have security. That's just the sad reality of the situation. I've been told that we were going to have 3 cameras, but as you can see, we have 4 or 5 or 6 of them today. So if you do create any disturbance, any ruckus, any intolerance, you will be escorted outside, and we will inform Student Judicial Affairs. So that's the big threat for today. So let's please conduct ourselves with discipline, patience, and dignity. The same discipline, the same patience, the same dignity that's been preached to us by Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus Christ, and Muhammad, peace be upon them all. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Ataie representing the Muslims today, and we have David Wood representing the Christians tonight. Ataie, I quote, is the founder and president of the Muslim Interfaith Council, an organization dedicated to spreading and defending the truth of Islam in America. He received a Bachelor's of Science degree in accounting from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Since graduating in 2000, Ataie has been both a visiting assistant instructor of religious studies at Cal Poly, as well as author of books entitled In Defense of Islam, Confronting Christians with Their Own Scriptures, and Injilul Haq, the True Gospel of Jesus Christ. Wood, I quote, is a former atheist who converted to Christianity because of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I quote, Wood has earned degrees in biology and philosophy. He is currently pursuing a PhD in philosophy of religion and is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers. Our 2 speakers already know, but I'd like to remind you people about today's format. It has been decided that David Woods will be opening today's debate. He'll be speaking for 30 minutes. This will be followed by Ataie coming to the stage, and he'll be speaking for another 30 minutes. This will be followed by a 15-minute rebuttal from Mr. Woods, followed by which we'll have Ataie once again take the podium, and he'll have 15 minutes for his rebuttal. This time around, in order to spice things up a little bit, I don't know if you would like it or not, but the audience this time around does not have an opportunity to ask questions. What's going to happen instead is the 2 speakers can ask each other 5 different questions. They'll have a max of 3 minutes each for each response. After this session, Q&A session, David was going to come up to the stage and give his conclusion in 5 minutes. This will be followed by another conclusion from Ataie. And that's how tonight's going to be. Once again, I remind you, be very patient today, be disciplined, come here with dignity, respect each other around you, open up your minds. Look at things from a different perspective. We're students here, and there are educators amongst us, This is a great university. Let's take something with us when we go back. Thank you. The floor is yours, David.
Well, good evening. I'd like to thank the Muslim Student Association and College Life and Campus Crusade for Christ for sponsoring the debate tonight. And I'll just say that I think it's great that out here in Davis, California, Muslims can get together with a Christian group that has Crusade as part of its name, and everyone gets along. That's some good stuff. It may have taken us 1,000 years, but we're all here, and that's what counts. I'd also like to thank Ali for his willingness to debate such a sensitive issue. I have always been impressed by people who are willing to lay their beliefs on the table and say, go ahead, take your best shot. And Ali is one of those people. In fact, Ali is the one who chose our topic tonight. He was ready to put his faith in Muhammad to the test in public. And that sort of confidence is admirable. I do want to warn everyone here, again, that this is not going to be pretty. We're not here for an interfaith picnic. Interfaith picnics are great, but this is a debate. We're not here to affirm one another's faiths. I'm saying that Ali is wrong about Muhammad, and he's saying that I'm wrong about Muhammad. I'm pointing this out because for many Christians and Muslims, our beliefs are the most important thing in the world. And when people start saying our beliefs are false, wow. To be honest, I'd rather have someone say something I don't like about my wife or mother than about King Jesus. But at the same time, I recognize that people disagree with me, and that it's important to understand their reasons for disagreeing with me. Now, if you're here tonight, I assume that like me and like Ali, you are prepared to have your beliefs challenged and criticized. And Ali and I will certainly do our best to challenge you this evening. Just to give you a little background as to where I'm coming from, I converted from atheism to Christianity when I was 20 years old. I was trying to prove that Christianity is false by refuting the resurrection. I came up with some theories to explain away the evidence, but in the end I looked at my theories and said, you know, this just doesn't fit the facts. So I had a decision to make. I could either ignore the facts and go on with my life as an atheist, or I could surrender to Jesus Christ as Lord. It was the most difficult decision I've ever had to make, but I decided to submit to God and to give my life to Jesus Christ. About a year or two later, I met a convert to Islam named Anthony. Anthony and I became weightlifting partners, and as we lifted weights, we would debate Islam versus Christianity. So there was testosterone all over the place. But Anthony and I didn't remain friends for very long because we were both so eager to win the argument that we ended up getting pretty nasty at times. And we eventually got to the point where we weren't even presenting evidence anymore. We were just making fun of each other's religions. And that was both our faults. We were young. But I've always regretted that because for a while we were good friends. Later, as I was studying philosophy as an undergrad, I focused on religious studies and I studied Islam as part of my coursework. We had to read modern works on Islam from people like the Islamic scholar John Esposito. And when I read those modern sources and I listened to the lectures of my Muslim professor, Muhammad sounded like a pretty good guy. In fact, I once wrote a paper on what an amazing job Muhammad did in Arabia. I even gave a speech on that topic at 2 different universities. Well, while I was in college, I met a man named Nabil Qureshi. One night we ended up sharing a hotel room during a school trip. That first night, before we went to sleep, I was reading my Bible, and Nabil was putting away his clothes. And all of a sudden he said, "So, are you a hardcore Christian?" And I said, "Yes," and it was on. And it was fun, too, because Nabil is one of the smartest people I've ever met. Later that weekend, we stayed up all night debating. In the middle of it all, I stopped Nabil and I said, "Look, I know what you believe. But if what you believe is wrong, if what you've been taught all your life is false, do you really want to know it?" And he said yes and no. He said yes, because I want to know the truth about God, and no, because leaving Islam would destroy my life. But then he said that his desire for truth outweighs his desire for comfort in this world. Nabil and I became best friends, and we still are. But we spent 4 years of our lives arguing with one another. We discussed Jesus and Muhammad, the Bible and the Quran, the Trinity and Tawheed. We went to scholarly sources. We watched debates. We talked to scholars. We read books. We wrote down our arguments so that other people could examine them. And it was in the course of that dialogue that I was able to weigh the evidence for Islam and to examine my reasons for rejecting Muhammad as a prophet. So the case that I present to you this evening is something that came out of a careful dialogue between best friends. Tonight I'll just be able to summarize why I don't believe in Muhammad. That's the downside of public debates. There's never enough time to cover everything, but we should be able to cover quite a bit. Just to give you a quick outline, I'm going to begin by talking briefly about why Christians are pretty suspicious when it comes to Muhammad. The debate tonight isn't about Christianity, we're focusing on Muhammad, but there are a lot of Christians here, and so I'd like to take a few minutes explaining why Christians disagree with Muslims on this crucial issue. After that, I'll discuss two popular arguments for Islam, and I'll try to explain why these arguments don't work. And finally, I'll address the reliability of Muhammad in terms of certain details of his life that many people find objectionable. So first, why don't Christians believe that Muhammad was a prophet? Well, the most obvious answer would be that Christians believe the gospel. And the heart of the gospel according to the New Testament consists of three things: the divine Son of God died on the cross for sins, and rose from the dead. So, Son of God, death on a cross, resurrection. Those are the three key elements of the gospel according to the New Testament. But we're also told in the New Testament that false prophets would come, and that they would try to change the gospel. Nearly 6 centuries later, Muhammad came along, and he said, "You Christians believe in God? Me too. You believe Jesus was born of a virgin? Me too. You believe Jesus was the Messiah? Me too." But there are just 3 things I'd like to change. 1, Jesus wasn't the Son of God. 2, he didn't die on the cross. And 3, he didn't rise from the dead. Now, when a Christian hears that, an alarm goes off. Hey, wait a minute. Those are the 3 most important things. He's changing the gospel, just like Jesus and the apostles said. Now, those of you who are Muslims would say Muhammad didn't change the gospel. Muhammad restored the gospel. Christians changed the words of Jesus. Muhammad just fixed all the errors that Christians added over the centuries. But here we find a problem. You see, when Muhammad preached in Arabia, there weren't a lot of historians around. People didn't have many writings from the 1st and 2nd century. What this means is that Muhammad could pretty much say whatever he wanted to say about Jesus, and no one could prove him wrong. So Muhammad could say, as he does in Surah 4, 157, that Jesus was not killed, nor was he crucified. Muhammad was free to say that Jesus claimed to be nothing but a prophet, and that Jesus' disciples were Muslims. No one in Muhammad's time could really show that these claims were false. But the world has changed. In addition to the biblical record, we now have writings by the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus. We have writings by Mara bar Serapion and Lucian of Samosata. We have the Jewish Talmud and the works of the early church fathers. We have an unbroken chain of testimony going back to Jesus' followers. And of course, we have the historical method and tools for textual criticism. So now we have the ability to test whether Muhammad's claims about Jesus line up with history. And when we apply the tools of textual criticism and the historical method to the ancient documents, we find that the Muslim view of Jesus as a man who claimed to be nothing but a prophet, who was never killed, who never rose from the dead, and whose followers were Muslims, this view of Jesus just doesn't line up with the historical evidence. So this would be my first criticism of Muhammad. We can test certain things he said, and when we do, we find that the evidence just doesn't support some of his claims. But I think the situation gets worse when Muslims try to reconcile history with the teachings of Muhammad. For instance, consider Muhammad's claim that Jesus wasn't killed and wasn't crucified. History shows that everyone in the 1st century was convinced that Jesus died by crucifixion. So how do Muslims respond? Well, the most common answer I hear is that God took Jesus to himself and disguised Judas to make him look like Jesus. Then Judas was crucified, but God made everyone think that it was Jesus. Now, when I hear explanations like that, all I can think is, that's your story? All of the available evidence tells us that Jesus died because God did such a great job tricking everyone? God must have done a great job indeed, because even Jesus' followers believed that he died on the cross. Think about that for a moment. Where did Christians get the idea that Jesus died on the cross? Well, if the most common Muslim explanation is correct, we apparently got this false idea from God. So God accidentally started Christianity when he tricked everyone into believing that Jesus died. Now, explanations like this are hard to accept if you're not a Muslim. But Muslims are really forced into making these sorts of claims because Muhammad said things that just don't line up with the historical evidence. And as we proceed through tonight's debate, you'll come to see more and more what a huge problem history is for Islam. But I think a Muslim could respond to some of this by saying, yes, we do have to reinterpret some of the historical data so that it fits our beliefs, but we have a good reason for doing so. We know that Muhammad was a prophet, and since Muhammad was a prophet, we can trust what he says about Jesus. And actually, I would agree with that reasoning to some extent. If we had good evidence for the prophethood of Muhammad, then we would have a good reason for reinterpreting certain things based on his words. But does the evidence show that Muhammad was a prophet? Let's change gears here and take a look at two common Muslim arguments. First, Muslims argue that Muhammad's miraculous scientific insights are proof that his message was from God. Muslim apologists point to certain claims in the Quran and the Hadith. They give these claims a scientific interpretation, and then they ask, how could Muhammad have known this? Now, based on the examples I've examined, I can say that I've never seen anything that looks like a miraculous scientific insight in either the Quran or the Hadith, though I'm sure that Ali has some interesting things to share with us. But apart from this, there's a tremendous problem with this argument. What do you do with all the scientific inaccuracies in the Quran and the Hadith? I'll give you a few examples. In Sahih al-Bukhari, Muhammad tells his followers, if a fly falls into your drink, dunk the fly in the drink, because one of the fly's wings has a disease, but the other wing has the cure for the disease. Is that scientifically correct? No. Flies don't spread cures for diseases on their wings. According to both Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, Muhammad told his followers that Adam was 90 feet tall and that people had been shrinking since the time of Adam. Is that true? No. It's physically impossible for a human being to be anywhere near that tall. So we read things like that in the Hadith, but what about the Quran? Well, Surah 1886 tells us that Alexander the Great traveled so far west, he found the place where the sun sets. According to the Quran, the sun sets in a pool of murky water. Do you know what stars are, according to the Quran? Surah 67:5 and the Hadith tell us that stars are missiles that God uses to shoot demons when they try to sneak into heaven. In Surah 27, ants talk to Solomon. In Surah 86, we learn that sperm are produced between the ribs and the spine. And according to several verses in the Quran, humans come from a clot of blood. All of these claims are scientifically false. Now, can Muslims reinterpret them? Yes. And they do. But why should non-Muslims reinterpret these passages? In other words, the argument from scientific accuracy is circular. We have to assume from the beginning that Muhammad was a prophet, so that when we get to the scientific errors, we can reinterpret them based on our belief that Muhammad was a prophet. Then, once we've reinterpreted Muhammad's claims to bring them in line with modern science, we can ask ourselves, how did Muhammad get all of this right? He must be a prophet. But that's what we had to assume at the beginning. And that's just circular. Second, Muhammad's argument for Islam was not a scientific argument. I'm not really sure what it is. I might call it an argument from literary excellence or something to that effect. But it's more of a challenge than an argument. We find the challenge in several places in the Quran. Surah 2:23 says, if you are in doubt as to that which we have revealed to our servant, then produce a chapter like it, and call on your witnesses besides Allah, if you are truthful. So the claim is pretty simple. If you want to prove that the Quran is not the word of God, just try to produce something like it. In case you've never heard a chapter of the Quran, I'll give you an example. Here's Surah 105. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with the possessors of the elephant? Did he not cause their war to end in confusion and send down to prey upon them birds and flocks, casting against them stones of baked clay, so he rendered them like straw eaten up? That's the surah. It's one of the short ones, some are much longer. But the question is, are the words I just recited so amazing that they could only come from God? Now, obviously not. So at this point, Muslims usually say, well, it only works in Arabic. But I think this only adds another problem to an already weak argument. Here's why. There are nearly 7,000 known languages in the world. The evidence for God's existence works in any one of them. Look at the world. Look at life. Search your heart. God exists. The evidence for Christianity works in any language. Jesus rose from the dead, so listen to him. But all of a sudden we get to the Quran and we get an argument that can only be examined if you're lucky enough to speak Arabic. Fortunately, however, those of us who are linguistically disadvantaged can investigate this claim because we can go to history and we can see how people who speak Arabic but aren't Muslims have answered this challenge historically. And when we do this, we find that Muhammad's challenge has been met over and over and over again for nearly 14 centuries. Now, those of you who are Muslims are thinking, no, the challenge is always, no one's ever been able to meet the challenge. But according to who? To Muslims? This isn't a challenge for Muslims. This is a challenge for unbelievers. Supposedly, when a person tries to write something like a chapter of the Quran, he'll realize that it just can't be done, and he'll feel ashamed. But that's not what happens. And we know this from early Muslim sources. In the early Muslim records, we read about a man named Al-Nadr. When Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, Al-Nadr used to follow him around. And when Muhammad would recite a passage from the Quran, Al-Nadr would say, I can tell a better story than that. And then he would recite some verses. And he would ask the listeners and say, in what way is Muhammad's story better than mine? What was he doing? He was doing exactly what the Quran says unbelievers can't do. And later, when Muhammad was more powerful, Al-Nadr was captured by Muslims and executed. Apparently, that was all they could do in response to his verses. Now, as far as I can tell, these are the two strongest arguments for the prophethood of Muhammad, the scientific argument and the argument from literary excellence. If Ali knows some better ones, I hope he'll share them. In the meantime, I would say that we don't have any good reasons for believing that Muhammad was a prophet. But it gets worse, because not only is there no good evidence for the prophethood of Muhammad, there's also good evidence against the prophethood of Muhammad. Let's turn now to the reliability of the Prophet of Islam. As I said earlier, when I was an undergrad studying modern works on Muhammad, I thought that he was a pretty amazing person. But while I was studying Islam with my friend Nabil, I did something that changed my opinion of Muhammad quite a bit. Instead of reading books written in the 20th century, I started reading the early Muslim sources. Ibn Ishaq, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, al-Tabari. I was pretty surprised at what I found. I'll share a few of the issues that bother me. First, there's the question of Muhammad's spiritual reliability. Pastor Jerry Vines is famous for saying that Muhammad was demon-possessed. I'll go on record as saying, one, that I don't think the evidence proves that conclusion, and two, that we should probably be more careful when we make claims of that nature. But at the same time, there are some troubling passages in the early Muslim literature. And I think that a debate is the place to examine them so that people can hear both sides of the story. Now, we know from Muslim records that when Muhammad began receiving his revelations, his first impression was that he was demon-possessed. We also know that after he left the cave, he became suicidal and tried to hurl himself off a cliff. We know that it was his wife Khadija and her cousin Waraka who persuaded him that he wasn't possessed, he was a prophet of God. Now, what happened to Muhammad in that cave when the Quran started coming to him? I don't know. But I know this, when Muhammad ran out of that cave, terrified, depressed, and suicidal, he was convinced that he had seen a demon, and that's a problem. But it's not the only problem. Think about the satanic verses. The verses that Muhammad revealed to his followers and later claimed were from Satan. Here's what happened. When Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, he didn't win very many followers. But he wanted his countrymen to convert to Islam. And he was hoping to receive a revelation that would help them. Then one day he got the revelation he was looking for. It said, "Have you not heard of Al-Lat and Al-Lusa and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." That's what Surah 53 originally said. It said that in addition to Allah, there are three goddesses that Muslims can pray to, Al-Lat, Al-Lusa, and Manat. Muhammad delivered these revelations to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them, and then his followers bowed down with him. But a little later, Muhammad came back and said that these verses, which he had delivered as part of the Quran, weren't really from God, they were from Satan. So when you read Surah 53, keep in mind the fact that it originally promoted polytheism and that Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. Those are problems. It's also interesting to note that at one point late in life, Muhammad was the victim of a magic spell that lasted about a year. According to several passages in Al-Bukhari, one of the Jews stole Muhammad's hairbrush and used it to cast a spell on him. Ibn Ishaq tells us that Muhammad was bewitched during this time, and Al-Bukhari adds that the spell made him delusional. So according to Muslim sources, God's greatest prophet was under a spell for a year. And so we look at the historical records and we find, one, that Muhammad originally thought that he was demon-possessed, two, that he became suicidal when he started receiving his revelations, three, that he delivered verses from Satan, and four, that people could cast spells on him. Muslims look at all of this and say, no big deal. I look at it and say, maybe there's something wrong here. Second, Muslims claim fairly regularly that Muhammad was a man of peace. I have absolutely no clue what sources they're reading when they say this. The early Muslim records are filled with acts of extreme brutality by Muhammad and his followers: assassinations, executions, beheadings, torture. We find Muhammad ordering people to assassinate people for writing poetry against Islam. We find Muhammad ordering people to assassinate people for insulting him. I'll give you a few examples. Ka'b bin al-Ashraf was a Jewish merchant. He never physically attacked Muhammad or his followers, but he did write some pretty harsh poetry. So one day Muhammad ordered his men to assassinate Ka'b, and they did. They cut him from his stomach down to his groin over poetry. According to Muslim sources, a man named Abu Afak, who was more than 100 years old, wrote a poem criticizing the Muslims. Muhammad said, "Who will deal with this rascal for me?" Salim agreed to do it. He waited until Abu Afak was asleep, and he stabbed him through the liver over poetry. When a woman named Asma heard that Muhammad had murdered an old man for writing a poem, she wrote a poem in retaliation. She called on people around her to stand up to Muhammad. When Muhammad heard about it, he said, "Who will rid me of Marwan's daughter?" Umair agreed to do it. He went into her room, found her with her 5 children, one of whom she was breastfeeding, and he stabbed her to death over poetry. When one of Muhammad's followers heard a man say that he would never accept Islam, the Muslim took a bow and drove it through the man's eyeball, through his brain, and out the back of his head. Muhammad blessed his follower for his dedication. Muhammad once told his men to execute a slave girl who wrote a song making fun of him, and they did. A man named Al-Huwayrith was executed for insulting Muhammad. A woman named Sarah was trampled to death by a horse for insulting Muhammad. One day after conquering a city, Muhammad ordered his followers to torture a man named Kinana because he was hiding money and the Muslims wanted it. Muhammad told them to light a fire on Kinana's chest until he told them where the money was. Then they cut off his head. As Muslims in the room know, the Quran allows men to have sex with their slave girls and female captives, those whom your right hands possess. To give you an example of how this practice was carried out, when the Muslims conquered Banu al-Mustalik, Muhammad allowed his men to have sex with the women they captured, even though these women were about to be sold into slavery. It's also important to note that the families of these women had just been slaughtered by Muslims, and yet it was perfectly acceptable for Muslims to have sex with these grieving women who were about to become slaves. Now that's just a sample of the details we find in the early Muslim literature. There's much more we could talk about. Muhammad winning converts by robbing caravans, Muhammad beheading hundreds of Jews who tried to defend themselves when they realized they were being eliminated, and so on. But you get the picture. Third, let's talk about Muhammad's wives. Surah 4:3 says that Muslims can marry up to 4 women. But we know from history that Muhammad had a lot more than 4 wives. So why did Muhammad get more? Al-Tabari puts the number at 15. We know from references in Al-Bukhari that Muhammad had at least 9 wives at one time. So why did Muhammad get more? The answer is found in Surah 33:50, which says that Muhammad, and only Muhammad, could have as many wives as he wanted. So the Quran lays down a rule for Muslims saying they can have up to 4 wives, But Muhammad receives another revelation, giving him and him alone special moral privileges, namely lots of women. If you believe in the Quran, there's no problem here. God just wanted Muhammad to have more wives than his followers could have. But for those of us who aren't Muslims, I have to say this looks awfully suspicious when a prophet receives revelations and those revelations give him more sexual partners than other people. Another concern I'll point out here is Muhammad's relationship with Aisha. It's a historical fact that Muhammad had sex with his 9-year-old wife, Aisha. The question is, what do we do with it? Now, I think that we do need to understand that this was a different culture and a different time, and that we need to consider this when we try to make judgments. But at the same time, Muhammad is supposed to be the greatest man who's ever lived, an example for all mankind for all time. And I think that many people in this room would agree with me when I say that history's greatest man probably shouldn't be having sex with a girl who, according to Muslim records, was still playing with dolls. Now, please don't misunderstand me when I raise these criticisms. I'm not trying to convey the idea that Muhammad was a completely horrible person. I don't think he was. Muhammad had many good qualities. He was dedicated to prayer, to fasting, to helping orphans. He was courageous, and there were times when he was merciful. But this doesn't make him a prophet. And when we go to history and we try to let history give us a more complete picture of Muhammad, we find that the prophet, the amazing prophet we hear about from Muslims today, is very different from the man who lived in Arabia 14 centuries ago. So how do Muslims respond to these historical criticisms? Well, there are two basic approaches. First, some Muslims simply reject anything they don't like. If they find an embarrassing story in the early sources, they throw it out and pretend it never happened. Some Muslims have made an art form out of rejecting material from our earliest records of the life of Muhammad. If you're wondering why Muslims would want to throw out historical material about Muhammad, the reason is simple. When we go to the earliest sources, we find things like the satanic verses, assassinations. And some Muslims don't want to deal with this, and so it's easier to sweep all of this under the rug. Unfortunately for Ali, everything I've said so far is very well attested historically, so he's got some explaining to do. Second, when people criticize Muhammad, the most common approach I see among Muslims is to say, well, other religions have problems too, as if this makes Muhammad's problems go away. For instance, if you ask a Muslim about Muhammad's relationship with Aisha, he'll probably say, well, in the Bible, Mary may have been young when she was married to Joseph. Or if you bring up Muhammad's assassinations, you'll hear, well, there's violence in the Old Testament too. But I have to say that these aren't answers. In fact, in logic, this approach is considered a fallacy. It's called the tu quoque. The tu quoque works like this. Suppose you catch me lying, and you say, David, you just told a lie. And I say, well, you've lied too. You see the problem? Even if it's true that you've lied, it wouldn't change the fact that I lied. And so that's why this is a fallacy. Similarly, if the historical records tell us that Muhammad ordered his followers to torture a man for money, Muslims can't simply say, but there are bad things in the Bible. That's not an answer. It's true that there are some tough passages in the Bible, and Christians need to be able to give answers for these passages. But the point remains, we're not here to talk about Christianity. We're here to talk about Muhammad. We're here to see whether Muslims can show that the things they say about their prophet are true. Now, what I'd like to know from Ali is, how does Islam respond to these issues? Without committing the tu quoque fallacy, without denying the evidence, how does Islam answer the objections I've raised? That's the question tonight. But I'll confess here as I close that in my experience, I've found that Muslims don't have any real answers for the problems I've raised. I learned this while I was debating my friend Nabil. Nabil looked at these criticisms and he traveled the world looking for answers. He couldn't find any. In the end, he poured out his heart before God, and God gave him guidance. Less than 2 years ago, Nabil became my brother in Christ. And by the way, Ali, Nabil says he would love to debate you. That's the impact that careful investigation of the evidence can have on a person. Now, Ali is familiar with just about all of the criticisms I've raised, and he's had plenty of time to prepare. So we can expect to hear the best answers Islam has to offer. I haven't kept this in a closet. He knows what I was going to say. And I'm certainly looking forward to his response.
Please refrain from any applause. I understand it's kind of natural for us to clap our hands after speaker leaves, but let's carry ourselves with some discipline. I'm sorry.
It's not me, it's them. I'll let you have the floor for 30 minutes.
السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المصطفى صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. جاء الحق وزهق الباطل إن الباطل كان زهوقا. I bear witness that Muhammad, the son of Abdullah of Arabia, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, peace and blessings of God be upon him, is the messenger of God, the God of Abraham, not the moon god or the Arab god or the God of the Middle East. No, the Lord of the heavens and the earth. Adonai Elohim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, prostrated himself on the Mount of Olives and worshipped God, that is the same God, we believe, who sent Muhammad, peace be upon him, 6 centuries later. I believe the Prophet was who he claimed to be. He said, Ana Sayyidul Bani Adam, wala fakhri. I am the master of the children of Adam, and I do not boast. He said, Ana khayrul khalqillah. I am the best of creation. We